Hi everyone, this is Tim. Welcome to North and South podcast. It's a real honour today to get Alex back on, who was on, I think it was March of last year, or was it of this year? Time just collapses in on itself when you're doing podcasting every week. But Alex spoke brilliantly last time about psychedelics and overcoming PTSD and his journey through the years, military background, and going from a point where he was suffering with well-being issues day by day to a point where he's now currently not on any recognised, what you might call, well-being or mental health medication, which I find fascinating, given my journey as well. So, Alex, we spoke about psychedelics and the journey that you've been on to recovery. How are you doing at the minute? What is the latest?
Yeah, feeling really, really good about my life and where I am. I've left full-time employment and I'm now a trainee therapist in Swansea St Trinity University, full-time. So I really feel quite accomplished going from a high-paid consultancy role within a bank in the Netherlands, and now like willing to face that fear of security and uncertainty and step into a student position. That has been challenging in itself, but just trusting really the process and trusting that this is where I'm meant to be with my life experience and things I can add value to so many people's lives by just being able to relate to their pain and their suffering.
We're going to talk about the importance of nature today as a general theme, but we're going to touch on lots of other things. But I've just been listening to a podcast about mentoring and how even when someone is well established, people learn when they mentor others, no matter what the industry. And one of the things I've kind of realised as I've gone through life is I thought, like, when I'd finished my master's or when I'd finished my degree or my teacher training certificate, like that's it, and now I knuckle down. But I've actually, some of the biggest learning I've done has been since I had a bit of a mental health crisis when I was 29. It's what I've discovered since then, off my own bat, through informal stuff, through formal stuff. And I remember listening to John Kabat-Zinn, who's a meditation specialist. He's the guy who's often considered the man who brought mindfulness to the United States. And he said that even if someone's on the deathbed, we've still got something to play with. There's still some development or some healing or something going on there. And it sounds so simple and common sense. And I think if you catch people in the right mood, they'd agree with that. But sometimes the overall person who's in control of our lives day to day, it's very easy to just slip into that trench warfare mentality, isn't it? And, I've done all that now, I just need to settle down, when in fact life is an unbelievable learning adventure. I think what you said there, you've also got experience which you're bringing to the therapy. But for me, the things I do every day, just listening to that podcast before, because I did mentoring and coaching when I did my master's in education. It's fascinating. And you can bring that into your day-to-day relationships and your day-to-day improvement. Now, you did a task with me as well on the last podcast where it said, draw a picture of your body and write down what you want to do in life, who you are, and what obstacles there are, and be aware of that, and then think of the little steps that you can take. And that's something which I do. I try to do it fairly regularly, like maybe once a month, once every couple of months, because you lose focus, don't you? How difficult has it been for you to get on this journey from your past? And do you think that your history of trauma has opened up this possibility to better yourself the way that you've just explained it? That was a big question.
Yeah, it's good though. I'm hearing that reflection is really a pivotal, important part of life, really. And when people are on their deathbed, they're essentially in a deep reflection. So like that does provoke learning and growth, because they study in the past, they study in the present and the future. That's really, I think, what the majority of healing comes from, that really is from reflection. And the difficulty level for me, I would say very high in difficulty, because I was a a crack cocaine addict after I left the military. So that's I'd say one of the most powerful substances that I could have had entangled myself with. So I had to face a lot of fear of never being any different. So I had moments of thinking to myself, like, how am I going to get through this? What am I going to do? Like, I felt suicidal at times. I remember the only person I told I was suicidal was my mum. I remember crying to her, like, just it absolutely distraught, thinking like that the addiction wasn't worth the battle and the shame was more powerful than living as an addict. And so that like, when you ask me how difficult, I think it's probably the most difficult thing that I've ever been through in my life, is being in a career where I had high levels of self-esteem. I went traveling and I went on operations, helping other people looking at me with such like inspiration and such pride. And then I'm sitting in houses with people smoking heroin, and I'm smoking crack cocaine, and I'm looking around, and all I feel is this deep, dark shame of, who am I now? Like, what's my life come to? And even thinking about trying to, like, even thinking about looking forward in that scenario is too painful, because all I think about then is like, where's my next drug coming from? Where's my next drink coming from? Like, I think the real way, the only real way that I come through that was by reflecting. And like, I felt like I was going to die quite a few times, to be honest. I've had moments where I took so much of a drug that I had heart palpitations and I was going into a panic attack. And I was like, I had quite a few moments actually where I get other people who can relate to this if they've used drugs or they've maybe used heroin or different things like that, where they overdose or they drink too much and they end up in hospital. And then they just have moments where, more moments than anyone ever needs, that they think their life's going to end and it doesn't end. And I think you only get so many chances after with that sort of behavior, because eventually it doesn't go in your favor. But I had to be pushed all the way to the edge, really, and get that suffering, deep suffering, darkness to allow that to become my liberation. And now where I am now, I'm in complete like feeling of liberation and freedom, with the understanding and the contemplation of what being a prisoner is like, being a prisoner in your own body and your own mind. And no matter where you run or who you run for help, only you can do the work, really. Only really you can rescue yourself in that situation. And that's quite harrowing, when you think that, oh, I'm going to go to rehab and then they're going to help me. I'm going to go to church, God's going to help me. I'm going to do all these things. But ultimately, it's about the pennies need to drop consistently to come to a point of, okay, I have to deal with my pain. My pain is keeping me where I am. What is my pain? Okay, let's look at it. And it's obviously overwhelming if you've got big trauma. And I had to look at that. I basically was nearly killed in Afghanistan. I had to look at that in deep like intricacy. Like, I had to pay a lot of attention to that, because I remember that was one of the biggest moments where I felt like I was going to die, and it like stayed in my body. That like deep trauma stayed in my body, and I was speaking to my partner about this. When these moments happen that are not, so there's no casualties in the actual attack, but you feel, and other people could feel like they're going to die, but you don't receive a debrief after that happens to you. It's almost like that you need casualties around you to then people to acknowledge that you need help. But actually, I feel like that was such a big incident for me, and there was no casualties involved, but it's because of how I felt in that situation. I couldn't run away. My fighting back was me just shooting at, and like, I couldn't see anyone, basically. I was bullets coming from everywhere, and I was firing at just into wherever I could hear the bullets coming from, and I literally felt like I'm going to die. I am going to die. And I think a lot of my future trauma, as in drug addiction and all stuff that came as a consequence of that moment, was because of that moment, basically.
Mm-hmm. I think when I've spoken to soldiers and ex-military, there's still a bit of a pride thing with many of them when I've broached this topic with them, the idea of PTSD, etc. And I remember watching Saving Private Ryan at the start, you know, where they take Omaha Beach eventually from like quite well entrenched positions, and then afterwards, like, one of them gets a bit upset and Tom Hanks' character's hand shaking, and the other guy's just standing there like as if, oh, I'm all right, you know. And I remember thinking, like, how do you deal with that by just moving on to the next thing? It seems it's something that you can only experience by doing it. And this is a depiction in a film, of course, which isn't real. But I remember looking at that and thinking, wow, that's powerful. And I always remember the Dante's Inferno. And I think the first line of it is, halfway through my life, I found myself in a dark wood, and the way forward seemed unclear. And I saw that line when I was in the midst of my depression in the late noughties. And it was like that line was written for me. Dante wrote it like 2,000 years ago or whatever. I went, wow, that was incredible. And then I saw it about 6 or 7 places in the months afterwards. And I'm like, did I not notice that before or what? And that captured it for me. And this idea that the darkest hour is just before the daybreak. And I do feel like what I went through in the late noughties, early teens, really, really made me into a better person. I'm still flawed, like anyone, and I do feel, and it's not easy for me to admit this, but I'm going to say it, like, I don't think I'm ever going to be truly happy. I don't think I've got the ability to be truly happy. And I'm not allowing that to restrict me, but I'm using that as a springboard to maybe look beyond and challenge myself to maybe find a solution to that predicament, as it were. But I think that when you go through something, I think sometimes that's better than just going along at 4 or 5 out of 10 throughout your whole life. To go down to 3, 2, 1, and then use that as a chance to say, right, I want to get up to 7, 8, 9 here, because that's not good enough. And I'm glad I went through that. I think that's powerful as well. And I think that what you've described, you know, perfectly explains that. When you've been through those kinds of situations, you start thinking, whoa, you know, it can be over in a flash. And you look at your mortality in the face. It's not an easy thing to experience, is it? Does that kind of resonate with you, what I've just said?
Totally. It's like you're facing all your fears, and all your fear comes up in one significant moment, and then you don't know what to do with that. You've got all this fear, it's there, it's within you, and I think the main thing that people suffer from is not dealing with that actual fear in a somatic way. So when the body comes up, when the fear comes up into the body, we react in a certain way. So we fight, or we freeze, or we run away. And sometimes the body needs to be able to reenact that or act that out for the trauma to then, for your body to achieve homeostasis again. And I'm reading a book by Peter Levine in the minute, and he says that post-traumatic stress actually should be renamed as post-traumatic stress injury, not a disorder, because actually you've just been injured by an event, and that event, you can actually recover from that event by different forms of therapy and different somatic work that people do in the world. And actually, I touched on something you said, like about happiness. Happiness is a state, isn't it? It's like we don't live in happiness, or we don't live in sadness. It's like almost life is about fluidity, and I don't think I'll ever be in a state of happiness all the time. But what I can do is, like, I can appreciate moments of happiness within my day, or moments of happiness within my month. But people really have to understand that that's not where we're supposed to be all the time. Like, life is about having fears and about having challenges and about having that, like you said, mortality. We are mere mortals, and this earth is full of risks. And almost like if you didn't have no risk, you wouldn't be a human. You wouldn't behave like a human, would you? You wouldn't have the same challenges or the same perceptions as other people. So you need that mortality to, like, sort of keep you in some sort of framework.
Absolutely. I mean, I journal every day now, and if I've got something on my mind, I journal about it. And I had to talk to someone about something, or I'll journal about it. And that helps me to process things in my head. And I never used to do that. And I used to just go through life, and things build up and build up and build up and build up. And I do feel better equipped to deal with the day-to-day because of me journaling and my ability to talk about things. And I think I've mentioned it on another podcast. I don't know whether it was with you in Blade Runner, where the second Blade Runner film, when something bad happens, the police officers, the Blade Runners or whatever, they're not human. They're like, an elevation from your human, but they have to do a debrief and they have to do something. And if they don't pass it, they're not allowed to go back out because they haven't sorted it out. And I remember looking at that going, that needs to happen. That's effectively what we do when we dream, you reckon, that you're processing all this and, all that. We find ways to get by, but we need to process these things far more and far better. And I think this fits in nicely with what we're going to talk about today, which is that access to nature. Because I had a funny day yesterday, and this morning I got up, it's a beautiful day, and I went for, probably did about 1,500 metre run, got in, had a shower, and I've been in a great mood ever since. And I ran through the park, and we've got like this beautiful low light bouncing off the trees, and, it catches the shadows and like a high definition. And tapping into nature, you spoke about it in the past, about, on the previous pod. You never say, do you, you've had too much nature, or I've had a little bit too much nature there. But this has always been something which has interested me, and I think this is part of mindfulness and also to do with dealing with traumatic stuff. So when did nature become a conscious thing that you thought that is very important? When did you kind of make that breakthrough? Was it it's always there, isn't it, in the background, but did you have a breakthrough moment when that kind of came to you?
Yeah, only in my recovery did I realize and recognize the power of nature. And then, because when you're recovering from something or anything, I guess, I feel like that it can deepen your empathy with others and with empathy with yourself. So when I would put myself in these positions, going down the beach, going in the sea, walking in forests, walking up the falls where I live around the Welsh mountains and different things, I would notice how I felt before and after. And I guess that what I would try and do is not to use nature as a reason, not to use my mental health as a reason to go in nature, but try and use nature just as a weekly thing that I would do. So I know the people like, I meditate when I feel anxious, or I do something when I feel a certain way, but I guess we want to catch the boat before it goes off into the sea, and then we're trying to like fight fire or manage risk then. So I was like, actually implementing these strategies in my week or in my day, I mitigate eventually then feeling low to the point where I can't go outside because I feel too anxious or I feel too depressed to get out of bed. And then I shame myself then for feeling that way, because I'm like, oh, look, you need to sort yourself out. Like when you start pep talking yourself, but actually you're just shaming yourself really for not being good enough to go out and do the things that you thought you should have done before. Yeah, so really, like, it's about plugging in, isn't it? As regular as possible. And it's like, almost, what is nature? Nature is like an organism, isn't it? If I can see the sun coming through the attic window now, and if I look at the sun, that is nature. So like everyone has access to look to nature. I was thinking before this podcast, does everyone actually have access to nature? But I was thinking then, different degrees of nature people have access to, don't they? Because we can look at the stars, we can look at the elements, the sun, different weather systems going on, and still appreciate that. Like, a lot of people like have this conception about rain, and they're like, oh, it's raining all the time. I'm like, actually, the plants are thinking, yay, it's raining, baby. They're loving it. The trees and plants are loving it. And we are like looking outside going, no, do not rain. And I just think it's funny. It's where your point of view is, and it depends on if you think something's benefits you or doesn't benefit you. I know obviously a tree would benefit from sun and benefit from rain. It would appreciate both elements.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think when I was really not well in 2007, 8, I remember going out with my dog, and I'd go out for 2.5 hours, walk down the canal, go to the parks. I was listening to music at the time, and I had one of those old iPods. It was before phones had music on and all that, but it was, I felt terrible, but I knew I was actually in a kind of present moment that just seemed nicer. So the dog was as fit as a fiddle, you know what I mean? 2.5 hours every morning. I wasn't working at the time. And getting up, having me breakfast and then doing that became part of my kind of, let's get the show back on the road. And I remember thinking how just the trees, while I was going through all this trauma, I was just looking around and going, that looks nice, and it's almost like you're looking for something, but it has a bigger resonance. But I did a Duke of Edinburgh course, a BELA course, where you're trained to do Duke of Edinburgh, and you had to do it on something, you had to do a little talk on something. So I just talked about the science of nature, how nature actually makes you feel better. And there was a special word for it, which I think is biophilia hypothesis, the biophilia hypothesis, the idea that just nature and living things makes you feel better, because that's what we are ultimately. So I did a little talk on it about the idea of feeling connected, part of something bigger, which might not necessarily be a religious thing, but just that feeling of connection you get in nature. And I think that was when I first formally thought about it, whereas the experience of walking my dog, I mean, I've always felt that thing about you go somewhere beautiful and that, and you see something amazing, you go, wow, look at that. But those two experiences of actually getting out to make myself feel better, and then finding out there was actually a studies that have been done into its benefits, that was where it kind of started to me. But I think what you said is important, because I read an article recently in preparation for this, actually, about how during COVID, some people had gardens and lived in some what might be called more leafy areas, and I go to watch Everton, and there's a lot of terrace streets near Everton's ground. They call it the Welsh streets. And I was walking down one of them after COVID, there'd been a reopening, and there was not a tree in sight. There was no back gardens with any greenery. And I remember thinking, imagine living here with like 3 or 4 kids during those lockdowns. That's going to have an impact. And we're seeing the impact. I mean, I work in schools. Some of the challenges that I see from young people since the COVID lockdowns has been quite phenomenal. But I don't think it's really said, isn't it? It's really not. You don't go to doctors, do you? And the doctors say, listen, you need to go out and walk around a bit in nature. It's all like take this and all that stuff. But I believe in China, one of the first things they say to you when you go to a doctor feeling unwell is like, they say, when was the last time you laughed? And, just little different ways of looking at it. But I remember during COVID, it really struck me, because it was beautiful weather in the first lockdown. We were quite lucky. But the second one was winter. And I remember thinking, that's a huge issue, people's access to nature, because apparently the UK has got the worst access to nature in the European Union. I don't know if it was wider Europe, just the way we've built up our society, etc. We've actually got some of the worst statistics for like access to nature. And it really struck me during COVID how powerful it was just to be able to tap into nature. And I just think that's so important.
Dan Buettner, he studies the centurions, the people who 100 over the world.
Yeah.
On Netflix, he has a show on there, and it shows all different cultures basically, and what they do, which contributes to them living over 100, and everyone. The congruence between all of them the nature is one of the biggest ones. For me, anyway, nature is like huge in that. Really, if you're not plugged into nature. On a related note, I seen a nervous system without, I think it was in a museum or something, where it just shows someone's nervous system, and it looks actually like tree roots. Yeah. If you always say, if you didn't know it was a nervous system, you could think, oh, that's actually like a root of a tree, I think. It wasn't, it was someone's nerves. So I think, there's a relationship between who we are and what nature is, and there's loads of different ways probably you could marry that up. Do you know what I mean? Like the eyeball looks like something like a galaxy, maybe. Do you know, like the center of the eyeball, it mirrors like a nebula star or something, like maybe along those lines.
Yeah, I read a great book about 20 years ago called The Hidden Connections by Fritjof Capra, and it was one of the best books I've ever read at the time. And he looks at the connection between things. He looks at systems theory and what non-hierarchical theories, and he had another way of putting it where things aren't necessarily in proportion. There's a lot of like imbalance, and that's factored into nature. But he looked at things how like our social systems and our bodies mirror nature and the way the universe behaves, and we're all part of that anyway, so it's no real surprise. But often that kind of Descartesian separation between nature and a mind, or the human mind and nature. It's an artificial split, really, isn't it? Because we are one and the same. And again, you don't have to get too spiritual for that, because there's a lot of evidence to show the benefits that we get. I mean, I think there's less incidence of mental health in the countryside compared to the cities in the UK. There's a longer life expectancy in rural areas, and incidences of anxiety and depression are less in rural areas, and there's got to be reasons for that, which is to do with I mean, to be able to just look out the window. As I get older, like, I go into different schools and I just think, oh, that's a nice view out the window. You go into some schools in some areas and you're like, it's not very nice, this, you know, thinking about like what Foucault said, like that, you know, a lot of our institutions resemble prisons. And I don't agree with everything Foucault said, but there is a truth that the way we behave and the way we live our lives in the institutions we spend most of our lives in, they can be very restrictive and restrict our ability to tap into our kind of natural feelings, if you like. I think that's really, really important. But I was up near Ormskirk recently. I went on 2 walks. Ormskirk's a small town, and I went out. It was just like in the middle of nowhere within 10 minutes walk. And I thought, what a privilege to be able to walk for 10 minutes and you can get away from it all. All I was going to ask is, how important do you think is it to be near nature, and, you know, in your experience, and what kind of things can people do if they're in a restricted place, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I am lucky enough to be on the coast of Wales, south coast, and I have access to the Brecon Beacon. So, you know, I have abundance of nature, really. Like, I can look out my window and see mountains and sheep and different things of nature. So that really helped me remind me what the natural world is. And I think when we look at our natural surroundings and we look at the greens, the different shades of greens and browns and all these things, I think we're actually reminding ourselves of our human qualities, and like, we're then connecting ultimately to ourselves, because we're connecting to a part of the earth, and we are connected to the earth, and ultimately the earth provides us with everything we need to build our houses. I've shut down, look around the room I'm in now. I can see the wood beams, and I can see the different elements that are in the room, and they're all fundamentally from nature. They've all come from the earth, and they support us in different ways. So when we look at the sun and we look at the grass and we're out walking around, ultimately it allows us to feel more human. And I think when we are in these big buildings and we're in these landscapes, like, for example, if you're in a capital city and you walk around and you don't see any green, actually what you are seeing is an extension of humanity, because it's been developed by humans. Everything's been built by humans. There's all natural resources, like anything really. You walk around to see the stone, the brick, the mortar, it's all from the earth. So you can almost, if you had the right point of view or perspective, connect to nature by looking at a roof of a house, because you're like, oh, wow, it's actually made by human beings 100 years ago. And then you can develop a deepening of yourself through anywhere you are, really. If you can't find something you can connect with around in your surroundings, you can ultimately close your eyes and imagine being in nature, or visualize being somewhere that you've been before, which is like a nature environment. And I know that from studying traumas, I know that you can hook up an ECG machine and tell someone to think about their trauma, and it will activate all their senses as if it was happening to them right in that moment. They'll go into fight or flight. So I know that the opposite can be induced. So we can think about nature, we can feel nature in our minds, and we can get the positives from that, because ultimately the mind works in that way. If you imagine something bad, it can make your heart race. It can make you feel a certain way. If you imagine something very tranquil, very peaceful, it can then have the same effect, where it'll calm you down. It'll make you feel more connected to nature.
Brilliant. I couldn't agree more. I think the The thing about your senses as well, using your five senses, just focusing on your breath, which is meditative, taking a look around at what's around you. As you say, you can see everything everywhere, and everything we see is nature. It's a product of nature. And people say, oh, it's a byproduct of nature, but actually it's come from nature. It's a product of nature. And I mean, you look at there's a famous picture, I think, of some of the steelworks in Cardiff or Swansea back in the day, you know, where there's all this like fire, like it's meant to look like hell. And you have that famous poem or hymn, you know, amongst these dark satanic mills. One of the lines about like how the cities have become like full of these satanic mills. I forget the which one it's called now. I used to know that quite well. But there's this idea, isn't it, that there's a division where in fact everything is part of nature. We just lose our sense of perspective. And we can tap into that at any time and just tap into our own body because we are nature. And it's kind of this idea of non-duality as well, which is like a Buddhist tradition where it's not about you inside and the world outside. Like everything you experience is a synthesis of you and the environment around you, which I find a very useful concept. And I remember when I was 16 and I went to the United States, and I remember the pilot saying, if you look out your right window now, you'll be able to see the southern tip of Greenland. And he said it's very unusual for it to be this clear. And I looked out and he had some really nice melodic song on. And it'll always stay with me, this memory where you could see the entire southern tip of Greenland. You could see snow-capped mountains. You could see icebergs and ships in the sea with the big V's behind them. And I just stared at it for about 10 minutes, just absolutely transfixed by the beauty of it. And I don't know if you've ever been skiing or snowboarding, but when you come back from a skiing trip, I was buzzing for weeks because I'd spent 2 weeks effectively, a week, sorry, up in high mountains looking at snow and mountains and just breathing fresh air. The skiing was great, but there was just something about it which was beautiful. And probably the most deep, connective, beautiful experience I had was in Australia, travelling on a coach through the night. We were out in the middle of nowhere, and all the lights went off on the coach, and I looked up and I could see right through the Milky Way. And apparently you can see this in the southern hemisphere better if you're away from lights. And I was just absolutely transfixed. I was just like literally looking through the centre of the galaxy, and it was breathtaking. I'm getting shivers down my spine just thinking about it. But that's always there on our shoulder. It's always there right in front of us, and we don't always acknowledge it. And we can tap into that at any time. And often it's just about perspective, because you can look at a beautiful screensaver or nature on TV, or even better, have a pet. And do you reckon stroking a pet or expressing love towards someone or something else is powerful? Having a plant in your house, because do you reckon that, like, you know, having connection with these kind of things, like to do with nature, there's unbelievable cognitive benefits, as you alluded to earlier. People develop a better sense of empathy, cooperation, better attention, better moods, and reduce stress. And there is something in us when we look at like a blue sky, whether it represented sunlight, which meant the food would grow. It's part of our programming to just feel like, you know, absolutely at one with nature. And is there a particular place or somewhere you've been when you felt that connection more than anywhere else? Because they're profound in me, those experiences. And, you know, just wondered if you had anything similar, really.
Yeah, the Lake District. And I know a lot of people up your way will really relate to how the Lake District has been probably instrumental in developing their connection to nature and beauty. That beautiful, awe-inspiring, wondrous like area of the UK is so beautiful, man. And I think that because my recovery was up in Liverpool, and we use the Lake District as like a stepping stone into our recovery to allow us to reflect and to connect with each other and to go for walks and do different things, really, like different it's like just different like exercises, I guess, like those therapeutic exercises that like different therapists and different organizations would encourage. That's where fundamentally that's where a lot of my recovery took place. In my early recovery years, like 2018, 19, 2017-ish. So I really got a lot of respect for that for that land. And I was thinking, like, if I go into nature and I feel something from that, a benefit, is it then telling me that I need to cultivate more connection in my daily life? Like, because like if we are nature and we feel an absence from something, then I guess it's we have to give that to ourselves, don't we? What are we feeling? Like a lack. We're feeling a lack of something, but only we can provide that deficiency to ourselves. We can go into nature and feel recharged, but we are allowing that recharge to happen because we're thinking about how wonderful the area is, and we are looking with emotions of joy or inspiration. We're like, do you know what I mean? It's like almost like energetically, we're charging ourselves up with all these positive emotions that we are creating inside ourselves by our environment. So if we could create the same emotions around in our daily life, imagine like every day we had awe-inspiring stuff happening to us, or we could think in awe or wonder and joy and different things like that. I'm sure our lives would be a lot different, but the reality is like it's more difficult to access them states really in day-to-day life when you've got a job and things are quite hard and challenging. So it's our responsibility, isn't it, to like look inside ourselves to find that wonderlust and awe, inspiration, or look at the sun, or look at look around you. Where can you find that? It's our responsibility to take control of that. Maybe we just need to think a little bit deeper, and we'll reach a little bit higher
Yeah,
states of consciousness.
I think that's beautiful. I think that's where it's almost like a religious or a spiritual thing. And I often associate it with music as well. Like you can listen to a beautiful piece of music and it's almost like transcendental. That feeling that you get. I mean, it's a big like archetype in Liverpool, the lakes. Where did you go? I went to the lakes. And it just represents like a beautiful form of escapism. And one of my cricket clubs we played for recently, I remember we went away to the lakes for the weekend. We were coming back on Sunday night, and we had that feeling in our stomachs as we were coming back into Liverpool. And one of my mates said, "Oh, I've got that feeling in my stomach of just dread as you come back into the city." And I thought that's exactly what it's like coming back from somewhere, and you're like, "Oh, now back to the daily grind." But by being mindful and tapping into those states, we can access them at any time. And in many ways, that's what wisdom is. When you turn that into a habit, that is what true wisdom is. And I think it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau who wrote The Reveries of the Solitary Walker, which I know we've spoken to before. Whereas when urbanisation in the town developed, yeah, it meant security, it meant, maybe guaranteed food, it meant that we were living in a civilized place with other people and we could get services. But at the same time, it took us away from that nature. And again, going back to the UK example, we've got some of the worst access in Europe, in the UK, to nature. And our housing and our homes is the least suitable for access to nature, which is just a historical trend which is emerged in the UK. But that feeling that it's just there, but that it's also right there in front of you. I think that's something that you can tap into, and in many ways, that's what comes to you. I remember going on holiday to the lakes when I was a kid, and I just absolutely loving it with school. I went 2 years on the bounce, and then me mum and dad went and hired a caravan in Devon at Lytton and Lynmouth, which is I think I don't know if it's on the north or the south coast, and they were the first stirrings for me of that just absolute appreciation of nature. And I remember feeling that kind of split between, oh, I'm back in school on Monday, back to that. And then there was this beautiful utopia just there. And in many ways, wisdom is about integrating them both and being able to tap into them both. And in many ways, that's a privilege, but also it's beautifully simple, isn't it? If you focus on that, that's something that you can kind of just tap into at any particular time.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking when he was speaking, someone who lives in nature all the time. So, for example, imagine someone who'd never actually been to a big city and they lived in Greenland, for example, and they do all the things that someone would do in nature. Are they then visiting the city and getting so much inspiration from the architecture, from the culture, from the hustle and bustle? Are they then thinking, wow, look at this, like this is a different form of humanity, like a different way of life? or is it perceptual? So then they would come to the city and say, "Oh, this is like a really terrible way of life. How would people live in this concrete jungle?" Is it purely perceptual? How, if you allow yourself to access that, like that state, whether you're in nature or whether you're in urban environment, I think it's down to how you see things. Depends on what meaning that is made for you. I think I just found that curious to ponder about. And also when you say to someone, "Oh, I wonder," and I heard someone recently talk about, I think it was a university lecturer. He said to his students, "Oh, guys, I want you to wonder about this." And then they were like, "Oh, no, actually, I will look on Google now." And he was like, "No, don't look on anything. Just in your minds, wonder about this." And he said something, and they were like provoked because this people are so used to finding solutions. And if I say to you, "I wonder what like a nebulous star looks like," and instead of just thinking in your mind, immediately you like have this compulsion to look on Google and look at images of a nebulous star. And like the university lecturer was trying to make a point of like we've lost our ability to like stay in a wonder state. We almost like want to know exactly everything about everything. Like we want to know the nth degree about everything rather than just being in the city and just being like, "Wow, this looks quite cool actually. This architect, these people, just looking at the people, how different they are around the place and how differently like city people operate from country people, how country people operate from people in the Swiss Alps or in the lakes. Like everyone's like different, and that's based upon how they've been nurtured in the environment, really." Yeah, and also in their like, and that doesn't mean just because they're in a nurture environment that allows them then to see beauty everywhere. Like they could come to the city and think that's horrible. This is horrible. I don't want to be here. Like rather than just thinking that this city is an extension of the people in the city.
I think that, I mean, I've been to New York a few times, and it's that exciting. New York, it's really nice place to visit. But when I'm there, going to the parks is a big part of it. Like Central Park. If Central Park was a park anywhere else, it wouldn't have the same impact as it does, as in New York, as in like the lungs of the entire island of Manhattan. And even the little parks that are dotted around New York, a lot of people spend their time there because, yeah, you get the excitement and the hustle and bustle and the bars and the food and all this stuff and the culture. But without that other counterbalance, you know, the place just wouldn't be the same. I mean, imagine New York without the parks, always this great city of excitement. It'd be a nightmare. It seems scary to me. I mean, I wouldn't like. It's a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't like to live there in terms of the pace. It's, you know, it's nice to go for a few weeks or a few days, but it does kind of scare me, that place. I've read. I don't know if you've read Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks about World War One. And he describes like the trenches and that, but one of the recurring themes throughout the book is the noise of bird song. So when there's like a lull in the fighting, or when they go somewhere, there's the birds, like that's still there even in the midst of this artificial kind of situation. And you reckon that there's a great book called Regeneration. There's 3 novels by Pat Barker, and a lot of it's to do with PTSD, because mental health became a big thing in World War One because you were stuck in a trench and they had these bombs coming at them and they were going mad, like at a rate that had never happened before in other wars, etc. before then. It was like where the industrial world kind of forced these young men into these terrible situations. But the theme of Birdsong keeps coming up as, it's just there. You can listen to it even between the bombs, you know. Nature continues, which, you know, I find really beautiful. But even like the lights in winter, like seasonal affective disorder, when we have less nature and less light, it does affect us. And that's something which I've certainly felt in the past. I have one of them sad lamps now. And when I haven't got it, I remember I left it in Scotland and I went 6 weeks without it. And I don't know whether I was attributing it to, but I was thinking, I need my sad lamp back, you know. I need me hit of natural light in the morning, because to just see the beauty of nature, the world lit up, there's just a pricelessness to it. There's just, you know, absolutely beautiful. And I don't know what the weather is like near you now, mate, but it's an absolute beauty out there, and it just lifts the mood, doesn't it? Just, it's there, it's free, and yeah, okay, we might not always have time or ability to get to it right on our doorstep, but it's always there, isn't it? And at the end of the day, no one can take that away from you, can they?
No, definitely not. Yes, it's the sun is beaming through now, and like you said, um, nature does have an impact on us as people. It 100% does, and I know that it's evident around the world, and people can tell you like nature will be really important for them to escape to nature or immerse themselves into nature, get that sunlight in the morning, like you said. The light directly impacts your mood.
Mm.
Um, and I noticed that when the winter comes in, it's almost like you go into a different state of you go into a different state, and you like become maybe like your mood lowers, your energy's a little bit lower, you're not springy in your step, and I think just appreciating that change, that subtle change, can stop you from being too hard on yourself sometimes, because we are seasonal as well, as like we are actually seasonal individuals.
Mm.
When like as we come into winter, it is really about like coming in inwards with the family, and you change the food you eat, change the seasons, the weather gets a bit different, and you can provoke maybe a change in like routine, sort of
Yeah.
like, oh, rather than doing this, I can do this now. I
Yeah.
can change things up a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like the extreme heat, which we've had the last few years in the summer. I don't like that. I struggled last summer with the extreme cold from about November to it just seemed to be a cold winter. I don't know if I'm getting a bit older, but for me, all the seasons are beautiful. When you get a clear day in the middle of winter, there's not more beautiful. It's like you need it more then, you appreciate it. But a lot of modern workplaces as well, you know, like they have aircon and they have what is called like that white natural light rather than that old yellow one that some old buildings have. But like I work in schools now where you can literally go into a building, go up a level or two and stay there all day. And I just always go outside, even if it's just for 5 minutes, just go out and breathe fresh air. And then I go back in, and I just find that so important. And when I was younger, I wouldn't have done that, but now I know what it is. And just to start tying things up, I don't know if you've seen Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, about global warming, where he just describes like that feeling of when you go to nature and you go, oh, I forgot about this. That beautiful, deep sensation that you have within you. And I saw a documentary recently, I think I messaged you about it, called Wildcat, about a young British soldier with severe PTSD who literally goes into the rainforest to try and look after, I forget what type of cat it was, a wild cat, bring it up, teach it to hunt and then release it into nature, and how attached he got to that process of just being in nature to deal with his PTSD. It was just a beautiful documentary about what nature can do, the potential of nature for people to deal with trauma. And then just finally, if you've got any other comments, feel free to come in. But there's been a lot of talk recently about the housing crisis in the UK, and I know that a lot of people are talking about, you know, garden cities, which we've had in the past, and new towns, some of which weren't the best. But there is a big potential in the UK moving forward that we get the housing right over the next generation or two, because people buying housing, it's expensive. But with the right investment, with a little bit of political consensus, we could really redefine what the UK is in the future with the way we build our houses. I mean, they're so much better now than what they were, you know, 20, 30 years ago. You see modern housing now, you've got a bit of space, greenery, grass and all that. It seems a pity when people put artificial surfaces down in gardens for me. I know why they do it, like, but there is a chance for us moving forward to really embrace this and integrate nature into us far more moving forward. And I know in London they've done, like, you know, some of the streets they've made like no car zones, and the
Yeah.
planting things in the street and all that, which I think is really good. But it's a big debate, and it's part of our future as well, that this idea that, we use nature to suit our purposes. We are nature, and that division, it's a false one. And if we can tap into it and revel in it, I think that's the way forward, isn't it?
Alan Watts says there's no separation between us and nature, and anything else is just it's perceptual. Like he says, we have a perceptual disease as human beings, that we think and things are separate from us, and it causes us great suffering to think that way. Because when we feel in like deep loneliness and things like that, that is obviously really provoked by a lack of understanding of like everything that is actually part of you. I think if people really felt how deep and expansive the universe is inside them, I think you'd struggle to really feel alone then, really,
Yeah,
if
definitely.
you have that access.
Definitely. And I think as well as that, I do feel like I've always had they had a thing in education about 20 years ago called like competencies, and it's now gone out of fashion. But one of the competencies was ecological intelligence. They were talking about like things like emotional intelligence and numerical intelligence. And I remember thinking, that's me. I'm like that. I remember even when I was young, like I was fascinated with whales and not the country. I like the country, don't get me wrong, but the animals in nature and being so intrigued by them, how they're similar to us and the way they behave and that. And I always felt like I had that in me. And the more we can feel that and just experience that and not live these artificial lives, I think a lot of trauma can be avoided in the first place if we do that. I mean, even if you think of war zones, it's because people are creating artificial divisions between themselves.
Yeah,
It's so frustrating, and ultimately, we're all effectively the same. We're all trying to fit in with nature and survive, and without trying to sound too like utopian towards the end of this, I think we are nature. We're all the same species, and
yeah,
we need to look after ourselves, which means looking after nature and looking after biodiversity, etc.
yeah. I don't know which school of thought said this, but the human condition. They talk about the human condition and just says how like it's like one of suffering, isn't it? It's like we track so much suffering by how we think of everything. The way we perceive things is so egoic
Mm.
and so, like dualistic. It is. We do think in left, right, black, white,
Mm.
this, that, up, down. We think like we're really logical in some ways, but I think the ways that we develop in this country is really it's left brain thinking. It's so logical, and like some other countries, they're really, really like tap into their right brain, their
Mm.
creativity, their play, their artistic, their music and stuff like that. I think more creativity, I think, is really a good way to combat that like human condition. Because when we're like playing or we're in music or in theatre or doing things really which deepens connection, it's hard to connect when you're in logical analytic thinking. You're studying and you're like looking at an object. You're looking at an object from a subjective place. You're
Mm.
like study, study, study. But then when you're in the right brain, you're like, where are these colours? Where's this sound? How is this gonna? You're immersed into the world really.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's beautifully put. I remember reading a book about it was called The McDonaldization of Society. I read it at uni, and there was a chapter on it called The Irrationality of Rationality. And I mean, I'm one of these people. Obviously, rationalism is important. We need to think about things and go, right, how can we deal with this situation? And I'm like you, like I want to tap into the right brain as much as possible, but there's an important role for the left brain, but it's when it overpowers things and things just become irrational, where you reduce a job to, right, I was reading about a particular company that people buy stuff off the internet, which I won't mention, but what it's like working in one of their factories. But for them, that's their optimum way of making as much as they can and providing a great service for the consumer. But those people who are in those factories, it's not a very nice existence. But the rational brain can only get you so far. We do need to use that kind of right, creative part of nature brain to enhance our human experience and to revel in the holism of existence. When people say, oh, I've got to get through today and I've got to get through this, you go, yeah, okay, to a degree, that's a psychological tool. There are things which you find difficult or are unpleasant, but to wish our lives away, that's not really the way that we want to live our lives, is it? And this idea of, oh, I'll get there one day in the future, we need to be living in that present now, don't we?
Yeah, yeah. It invites a lot of thought to think that you need to get through something, because then you can ask yourself like, what is it that I actually need to get through? Is it the day or is it how I feel in the day? Because the day is just the same, isn't it? Everyone's got the sunshine. Well, everyone's got the rotation of the sun and the moon, etc. But then it's what we do. It's how we show up in the day is the ultimate, really, the ultimatum.
Absolutely. Just to finish it, people listening, I'm going to do it myself, and you can take something from this if you want, Alex, but let's just have a look around us at things which are beautiful and natural over the next few days. Try and like get 10 opportunities to go, wow, isn't that beautiful? Wow, look at that piece of nature. Even if you count them in your head on both hands, those little moments, and just see if that helps you to deal with those difficult days. So just something for people to consider. And also, Alex, are we going to get a retreat out in the countryside, mate? I know. I just want to get it out there so that maybe we can manifest it. But I would love to get a retreat for vulnerable people, for anyone basically, to get out into nature and just reconnect. So I know we spoke about it by text a few months ago, but wouldn't it be great to do something like that and just help people to connect?
It'd be good just to do a sensory retreat where we go out in nature and we sit maybe like in a circle with a fire, and we just like have a open sharing, talking about different things, and then we go off into it actually sounds like a vision quest. Have you heard of a vision quest?
Not in those terms, no.
So basically in like Lakota traditions, which is basically like a native tribe, they carry out a vision quest, and that what they do is they go into nature and they stand in nature or sit in nature, and they basically just connect with the trees and with the earth, and they think and feel about themselves being part of nature, and then whatever comes to them, then they'll take that as being wisdom. And it's like, so there's what we're talking about here is actually what other tribes and other communities would do, but in a more spiritual sense. So they look for like philosophical meaning from nature. So they'd go out with a question maybe that they've pondered on, and they'll ask nature that question like over the course of maybe a full day.
Yeah, that's a big part of modern psychology as well. The idea that if you've got an issue, state it, and then look for the message to come back, without trying to sound too like mad about it. But like, if you've got a problem, say it, write it out, speak to someone about it, and then just see what comes back. Sometimes you have got to go with it, because you can try and break things down and rationalise it to the nth degree. Sometimes you just need to go with it, don't you, and see what happens. Brilliant. Listen, mate, we could talk for 1,000 years. So let's keep our eyes out for potential places to set up this retreat and get things going. But absolute pleasure to speak to you as always, Alex, and best of luck with your studies moving forward. Hope to speak to you again. And your pearls of wisdom are phenomenal. You've lived, you've been through some tough times, and I think it's a real inspiration talking to you. So thanks for everything you've done for me as well. I've really benefited from speaking to you regularly.
Yeah, thanks, man. I really benefit from speaking to you, and I enjoy our friendship. So thanks, man.
Cheers, Alex.